Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we'll start this Zevachim daf Kuf, page 100. We are going to begin on the very last line on Sadi Testament Bays with the words Rav Mari Omar. So we're in the middle of discussing a question which we saw on question 1, which is also TB23. And let's just read the question. Ma tirtzu b'gemara al stiris dibri Rav Shimon im oinin maisi Pesach. So there's a seemingly contradiction whether or not someone who is an oinin, as we discussed yesterday at great length, someone whose one of his seven relatives died. So on that day, that is a din deraisa of being an oinin, and there's certain laws. If you're a Kohen Hedget, you can't do the avoda. Kohen Gadol could. And when it comes to the next day, we saw a machlokas, or rather that night, a machlokas, where their aninus at night is midrabanan, and Rav Shimon holds, in fact, it is midrabanan. However, according to the sheet of Rabbi Huda, he holds that even at night, that next night is also deraisa. So the question is, that night, which is the Rabbanan, do we allow the person who is an oinain to be able to eat the Karban Pesach? So in one place we said yes, one place no. So we gave one answer that said, Karban Pesach we will allow. However, the Chagigas Yodalid, which accompanies the Karban Pesach, we will not allow, which is comparable to a Shlamim. Fine. And we actually did give another answer, which seems to be reiterated here. So again, let's continue Sadi Testament Beis, Rav Mari Omar, as we continue to Kufam and Aleph, Lo Kasha. So we're going to now see three answers to this question. Kan Shemesul Meis Biyodalid. Person's relative died on the 14th, which on that day is a deraisa. The Karban Biyodalid, and the Kavur was also on that day. So in that situation, as we saw before, you cannot eat the Karban Pesach that night. Kan Shemesul Meis Biyod Gimel. Recover be a dalid. So on the 13th, you already were the oinain, which is deraisa, and then the next day, which is the 14th, even though it's the Yom Kavura, that's only din derabanan, and therefore that night you certainly could eat. And then the Gemara explains: Meisel meis be a dalid, recover be a dalid, yoy misa, toifis leilo mideraisa. So the day of the death, which is din deraisa, will also grab onto that night, and therefore you will not be able to eat the Karban Pesach. However, Meisel Meis B'Yodalid v'Kaver B'Yodalid, let me say it again, Meisel Meis B'Yod Gimel v'Kaver B'Yodalid, Yom Kavura D'Rabbanan, because the whole din deraisa was Yom Misa, which was the 13th of Nisan. The next day, where the Kavura took place, you didn't do the Kavura on that day, you waited another day. So that is Aninas D'Rabbanan. Eino taifis leiloi el Rabbanan. So it's only din the Rabbanan, and therefore the Rabbanan are not going to be hamidu midavreim b'makom kares, because when it comes to a Karban Pesach, unlike maybe the other karbanos, because Karban Pesach is very, very strict, that if a person doesn't bring it, there's a punishment of kares, so therefore they're lenient when it comes to that. So that's answer number one. I'll prove this to you. So he said that a person who's an oibel, not an oinain, he can immerse himself and then he can eat the Karban Pesach that night, but he's not allowed to eat kachim. So namely, why don't we say kamino achana yom misa deraisa, that the day is deraisa of Yom Misa, v'yamarta li es Yom Kavur d'Rabbanan kasha. So, in other words, it's hard to ascertain that this in fact would be the correct answer. Says Rashi, Doham mi aninus daharan ma'isila v'has Yom Misa havoy. Right, it was the day of the death is aninus. V'yad mahardit Yom Kavura. So it doesn't seem to be logical that should be the correct explanation. So by kasha kan shemes kainim chatzais, kan shemes acha chatzais. In other words, both have to be, are not talking about Yom Kavura, because that seems so obvious, because the whole pasuk of Aninus is only talking about Yom Misa. So to be machalik between them must not be talking about one's Yom Misa was on, and the Kavura is on the 13th, or the Kavura is on the 14th, but rather that the Kavura both took place on Erev Pesach. It was B'yoyim, and the Misa was also on the 14th. Says Rashi, Nidvi B'yoyim Misa Oyim Aninus Laila Rav Shimon the Rabbanan. He holds that Aninus at night is a din d'Rabbanan. Says Rashi, so why do we make a distinction? Kan shemeis koidem chatzais, kan shemeis lacha chatzais. So, koidem chatzais, let's say the mace died, which means you became an oinein before there was a chiyuv of bringing a carbon, because you only bring the carbon Pesach after chatzos on Erev Pesach. So it was already chal the halachos and dinim of being an oinein before the chiyuv of the carbon Pesach. So so since you couldn't bring the carbon Pesach because you were an oinein before, so you're an oinein, and therefore that's the reason why you can't bring it. But let's say achar chatzos, the Pesach lo aninos. Since at the time of chatzos, at that moment, if you were quick, you would have brought the carbon Pesach immediately. It turns out at 2 p.m, that person's relative died. Now the truth is that it was at the time chatzos came, you already had a chiyuv of having to bring a carbon Pesach, and therefore because of that, we say that that the din is that you can still bring a carbon Pesach. Okay, so it's almost ironic. Seems like the opposite. That if your relative died before, right? So you would think, well, if your relative died before, maybe earlier in the morning, so maybe the din is more lenient. No, it's the opposite, because since you're an oinin before the chiyuv carbon, so therefore now you don't bring the carbon. However, if you were chayiv the carbon Pesach after chatzos, which everyone is, and then only later you became an oinin, so then taka the din is you would be chayiv to bring a carbon Pesach. So the question is, how do we know? How do we actually see that we could make such a distinction? To Sanya, the pasuk says law. In pasuk in Vayukra Chaf Aleph it says v'lachaiso habesula, to your sister who's a besula hakroy ve'elav ashul haisel is, she's not married, lo yatama. So you're allowed to become tamei. A kohen can become tamei to his single sister. So what do we see from here? It's mashma mitzvah, that you have a mitzvah. It's a chiyuv to become tamei to her. Lo ratza mitamanais al karchay. Let's say, no, I don't want to become tamei. No, we force you to be oisik in the kvura, and therefore you have to take care of that, right? You have to do her kvura. Umasa b'Yosef Akayin was actually a story. Shemesa ishtoi b'erev Pesach, v'ratz latamo. Like again, it's interesting. It's like priorities. Like, I don't want to become tamei. Your wife just died. V'nimnu achav kohanim v'timuhu. They made him get tamei, bal korach, against his will. The reality is, we don't care whether or not you want to or not. This is what you're supposed to do right now. You have a chiyuv to bring a carbon. You also have a chiyuv to take care of your relatives. Or minhi. The pasuk also says lachaisai. So it says aviv imo achiv lachoso lo yitama lehem b'maisam. Don't become tamei with them ki nezer l'kav al roshai, because you have the status of nazirus. So as a nazir who cannot become tamei, so he has certain restrictions. So why does it mention all of these relatives? We know the Zayin Krivim. So let's say, and you have all these other psukim which come to tell you all these different dinim, which is actually a very nice long Rashi in the third parak in Brachos, which usually when you learn that sugya, especially someone who hasn't learned any kutcha before, you do that Rashi before you do the Gemara. So just to understand the dynamics of this pasuk. So this is an inyan. So he said, well, what if you're a you're a nazir, but you can come in contact with a mace mitzvah, so the mace mitzvah overrides. And it says even if, let's say, you're kohen gadol, nazir, etc. Okay. Then it's an Inyan. It says what happens if you're about to do the carbon pesach, which these are chiyuvi kares if you don't do them. V'shamash mace lo mace, and when is relative? Yachol yitama, sa'armet lo yitama, so you would think you should become tame. Sa'armet lo yitama. You don't have to become tame for these people because you're being oisik in a mitzvah of you wanted to bring the carbon pesach. So this is kind of a shtickle manda. This is telling you that when you have in the balance two things, you have either dealing with one of your zayin kroivim, or bring the carbon pesach, and don't become tame. But we just said before, law comes to tell us that even about korcho, you should become tameh and not bring the carbon pesach. So it's a stira. So probably the distinction is as we just said. It's all totally if it's before or after chatzos. Before chatzos, so then we can just say, well, since you're an oinin before chatzos, so the din is that okay, deal with this, and now you should become tameh. And you should also not be able, you're not going to deal with the carbon pesach. There's a pesach sheni. If, let's say, you were oinin after chatzos, so that's what's talking about over here. When it says, v'shama, that you were holach lishchet es pischay, it's a good reading. What do you mean you're going to shecht your carbon pesach? Must be that it's already after chatzos, and you're about to do the mitzvah. And then only afterwards you hear that you're an oinin. So in that situation, you bring the carbon pesach. Okay. So maybe both cases after chatzos, and maybe it's all told in the machlokas Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Kiva Sanya Luyatam or shows that Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Kiva Eimer Chayva. Maybe it's just totally on the machlokas whether or not you're allowed or not allowed to refrain from becoming tamei. Lo sakadartach. You can't say that the Reisha that he Rabbi Kiva Katani law. The Reisha is Lefi Shitas Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said that you're obligated to become Tameh. The sign Rabbi Akiva Omer Nefesh, when the pasuk says Nefesh, and the pasuk says Koyme Haziru Hashem Al Nefesh Meis Lo Yavoy. While you're in Nazir, you're not allowed to become Tameh to a mace. So Elu HaKroivim. That means you're not allowed to become Tameh to your relatives. And it also says mace. Elu HaRachaikim. So this is referring to people who are not your relatives. You can't become tummy not only to rechaikim, but even to your kroivim. Well, aviv ein matama avu matama hu meis mitzvah. So the question is, so then why this was the minbar vav? That was the first pasuk, and then the next pasuk immediately afterwards says, your father, your mother, your achiv achayso yatama. Well, of course we know. We already made the drasha that nefesh meis is coming to tell you Kroivim and Rechaikim. So of course Kroivim are your father, your mother, your brother and sister. So Ima, so why does it mention all these people? So means you can't become Tamei your father, but you can become Tamei mitzvah. Well, Imo, Hoya Koyin v'hu Nazir, let's say you're Koyin and a Nazir, Imo hudin a matama of a matama l'meis mitzvah. Still, you can become Tamei to a meis mitzvah. Achiv, Shim Hoya Koyin gadol v'hu Nazir, L'achiv hudin a matama l'meis mitzvah. So Harsha Hoch Ishchedes Piskal Lemos Benoi Ushom Shemes Lomes. So as we said, you're about to do the carbon pesach, right? Which it sounds like again, right? It's mashma. It's after chatzos, right? As you are bringing the carbon. Yochli tamo amadoli tamo yochel kashem shem tamo achaisoi kachem tamo meis mitzvah tamo no achaisoi achaisoi tamo tamo hula meis mitzvah. So again, we derive from here, says Rashi, zeh shahaya kohen gadol and nazir. So this guy is a nazir and he's a kohen gadol, and not only that, we also say he has to bring his carbon pesach. Avzel achaiso patartilcha. boy. You don't have to be matame to your sister. But matame l'meis mitzvah. Doesn't matter. You still have to become matame to a meis mitzvah. Dim enu inin l'nozer levadatin in l'mishiyesh boy kol elu. So it's coming to include this. So again, we say that this is Rabbi Akiva's statement. Rabbi Akiva Omer. This whole drasha is Lafi Shitas Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, you can't say it's all totally on Machlokas Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says it's a chayva, and maybe that would be the first case. But the second brisa is like Rabbi Shmuel. But Rabbi Akiva is the one who brought this down. So obviously, Rabbi Akiva agrees to this statement. So it must be that even though Rabbi Akiva holds that it's a chayiv to become tamei, that's only if you were an oinen before chatzos. But after chatzos, if you're an oinen before chatzos, but after chatzos, so then you're not going to become tamei to your relatives, only to a meis mitzvah. Okay, I think we got it. Kuf Amud Beis. So we have a few answers already, and now we are going to get to our third and final answer. And this is again TB23. Again, the three answers specifically about a korban pesach. Rabbi Omer idi beidi acha chatzais. Below kasha kan kadim sheshachtu v'zarko lov kan lo acha sheshachtu v'zarko lov. So he actually doesn't make a distinction of when you're fit to be able to bring the korban. It means you actually already brought the korban pesach. If you already brought the korban pesach, you did everything, the zrika, and it's just, now it's a waiting game for the nighttime to be able to eat it, and all of a sudden you find out you're an oinen, so then you could eat the korban pesach. However, if it's after chatzos, but you still didn't do anything, so then the din is that you will not be able to eat the korban pesach. Armali Rav Adabar Masnal Rava Echad Sheshachtu V'Zarku as Damu Madhavi Hava. So after you did the shchita and the zrika, so you already did the mitzvah before becoming an oinen. So like, and it says Rashi, Hari Nifter, Yamai Dechia Chilaso Aninos Lad Rabbanan Tvei Mashar Kodshim. Armorvina Achilos Psachim Ma'akva. He actually holds, and that's not everyone holds like this, that the question, because you already did the mitzvah, so what are we talking about over here? No, you didn't do everything because you didn't eat the korban pesach, which is ma'akev. Do you think maybe you can't eat the korban pesach because now you're an oinin? Midrabba bar Rav Huna, based on Rabbi Rav Huna, who holds that in fact, again, it's it is ma'akev, and you can see in Taisus, it's actually a machlokus over there, whether or not we hold it's ma'akiv or not. In Perish Akuntris, the Savar lo commandier ma'akva. So apparently we hold, at least according to the Sugya, that the Chilas Pesach is ma'akiv, even though the Gemara throughout Psachim mentions numerous times that it's not ma'akiv. Okay. All right. But that's what we're going to say. Okay, so Omerle Sayis Madika Omerlach Rabuch. So you should basically pay attention to what your teacher is saying. Ravina says Rashi Shema loy shiyafa heshavicha al she'iltcha. It was very good what he answered on your question. Okay, fine. My deraba bar Rav Huna. He said, because there's a chiyuv of korban pesach achila based on Rabbi Rav Huna. Who was that? The Sanya. Yom Shemua ki Yom Kavura. When it comes to we already know that there's a din deraisa of the Yom Misa that you find out on the day that the person died. So then there's a din deraisa of an oinin. Yom Kavura, on some level, is a din d'Rabbanan, according to most shitas. Clearly, it seems maybe all shitas. Yom Shemu is different. It says Rashi, Sheshama Shemeis Lomeis, Ubeshemua Kroiva Shetoich Lamed Askinan. Let's say you didn't find out on that day, this is before telephones, that the person died. Found out your relative died 2 weeks ago, right? So that's called Yom Shemua. So that day doesn't have the same status as Yom Misa, because it wasn't your fault, you didn't hear about it until today, 2 weeks later, but it has the same din of Yom Kavura, mitzvah Shiva Ushloishim. What does that mean? Says Rashi, Miyom Shemua Mas Chalimnoi Zayin, we start counting 7 l'rechitza, v'ni'ilas asandal, v'lamad l'gihutz. So, it has the same din that we start, we don't actually start Shiva at the day of the death. We start it at the day of the burial. So that's the din. And so too, Yom Shemua, as soon as you hear about it, then you start sitting Shiva. And there's also the din of Shleishim, Legihu, it's like for wandering and things of that nature. And then the Gemara continues, L'achil's Psachim. And when it comes to eating the carbon Pesach, Kiyom Likat Atzamais. It has the same din as the day in which you gather the bones. Let's look at Rashi. Havi Yom Shemua Kiyom Likat Atzamais. The Kaimel Psachim. Hashemea Al Meisai. Let's you either hear about a relative that died, again 2 weeks ago you heard about it, or you heard about the person died, but he died 2 weeks ago, or V'malakat Atzamais, which sometimes happens for whatever reason. Sometimes the cemetery, they have to exhume the remains of the body. So the din is, there's a din of tumah, if you will, at least for that day. There's a sanctity of that day specifically, but you ought to eat kachim that next night. We said, what do you mean? If you're dealing with the bones, then you're tamei mace, and therefore you should have to do hazon days 3 and 4 and 7. And over there, Rashi says, obviously, if you gathered the bones, then of course there's a tumah shiva of tumas mace. But we're talking about you didn't do it, but someone else did it. So you didn't become tamei mace, but it was that day that a relative's bones were exhumed. So there's a din of avelus on that day. When it comes to that night, you're allowed to eat kachim. Okay, so when it comes to eating the carbon pesach, the din is it's kiyom likat atzamos, that you're allowed to eat the carbon pesach that night. So even though the likat atzamos took place today, but that night you're allowed to eat the carbon pesach. Echad zeh ve'echad zeh. In either situation, we're talking about the day of the kvura or the day of the likud atzamos. Toivel, you immerse yourself. Now, hagufa kasha. If we followed along, there's actually an apparent contradiction here. At one point we said Yom Shemo Kiyom Kavura, that we said that the day of hearing about the mace has the same halachic status as the kvura, l'mitzvah shiva ushleishim. But it also mentions L'chilas Psachim. And L'chilas Psachim, L'chilas Psachim Kiyom Likat Atzamais. And it says, however, when it comes to L'chilas Psachim, it has the din of the Likat Atzamos. Machlal Yom Kavura fil erev namil achol. Now it sounds that by Likat Atzamos you could eat the Karm Pesach that night. When it comes to Yom Shemua, you could eat the carbon Pesach that night. But Yom Kavura, not. That's what it sounds like, clearly, right? Because we're saying that on one hand, Yom Shemua has the din of Yom Kavura regarding Shiva and Shleishim. But Yom Shemua has the same din as Likat Atzamos regarding Chilas Kodshim, which is mashma only when it comes to Yom Shemua can you eat it that night, but not when we're talking about Yom Kavura. Yom Kavura, apparently that night you can't. Which, at least in the Havamina, it sounds like we're talking about Yom Kavura and Yom Likud Atzamos. You could eat kachim. So the question is, apparently, Echad Zeh, right, which is even Yom Kavura, right? That night you could eat kachim. So what is the din basically? What's the din by Yom Kvura, that today was the Kvura, that night can you eat kachim? It seems like a steer. So Machista Tanahi. It's actually Machlokes Tanaim, what the status is by Yom Kippur. Rabba Bar Rav Huna Omer Lo Kasha. Now, it's not a question. Kancha Shama Shemua Al Mesu Samach Shkei Sachama. One is, you heard about it before Shkei Sachama. Kan Shalikdu Loit Samai Samach Shkei Sachama. When you gather the Atzamais before Shkei Sachama. So what is this talking about? Looking at Rashi. Sevidetani Bekuhu Waichel Kanshim, that even Yom Kippur you're allowed to eat Kanshim. V'chol Shkein Pischai Kishbolav Echad Me'elu. If one of these things happened Lifnei Shkei Sachama, before sunset, the Havil Leil Erev Leil Yom Kavura, Leil Yom Shmua, Leil B'Yom Likud Atzamais. The Savi Yom Kavura Lo Tafis Leilo, a Filam Rabbanan, V'koshkein Yom Shmua V'Likud Atzamais. So basically, we're saying that you caught it. It was before Shkei Sachama, and since it was before Shkei Sachama, so therefore that night you are allowed to eat kanshim. When it comes to Yom Kippur, lo achol, that's kishilu echad me'elu achar shkei sachama, right? Dahavi le'layla zeh Yom Kippur atzmo, v'lo layla Yom Kippur. So basically, you did the burial. Did you do the burial after night? Once it's already shkia, so then already you can't say, well, yesterday we did the Kippur and now it's nighttime. So therefore, that's when we're going to be strict. So let's look at this answer. Kan sheshmo alman mesu samach shkei sachama, v'chein likidos lo atzama is samach shkei sachama, v'chein shemesu meis v'cover samach shkei sachama, v'kan l'achar shkei sachama l'achar shkei sachama. So that's the answer. Okay, I didn't read the whole thing. Okay, so that's one answer. So it's then yes, and over here no. L'achar shkei sachama mad havi hava. And we're talking about if it was after shkei sachama, what was. Says Rashi, Mali Pesach, Mali Shar Kochim. How can you make a distinction? Amr Kochim Asr B'Yom Likut boy, you can't bring anything. So why would we allow anything? El Shmamina Achilos Psachim Akva. It must be come tell you that Achilos Keren Pesach is Ma'akev. That's what it's come to tell us. Says Rashi, Lo Hamidu Divrehim B'Makim Kares. However, we're not going to say that even though it's true that he did everything, so we can say, well, how about Achilos Pesach? We're going to be lenient and allow him to eat the carbon Pesach, even though it's true that he did the burial later on, right? Doesn't make any difference. We're still going to be lenient in this case. That's the idea. Okay. Rav Ashi Eimer. My echad zev echad zeh kamer echad yom shmu v'echad yom likud toivel v'oichel b'kachim l'erev. No. When it says echad zev echad zeh, it's not talking about Yom Kavura, because Yom Kavura taki you're not allowed to eat kachim. However, when it's talking about echad zev echad zeh, it's talking about the day you heard about the mace and the likud atzamais. Those two situations, that night you could eat kachim. I b'had Rav Ashi b'dusahi. Even though that sounds like a great thought, it's actually impossible and it's not correct. Michti. Alakoi zevazeh. Miboile. Alakoi zevazeh miboile. Right? It shouldn't say echad zeh ve'echad zeh ve'echad zeh. Right? It should say zevazeh miboile. The proper language is what it is. It should say it that way. And the fact that it doesn't say it that way, it's not excluding Yom Kavura, it's including. Okay. So my Tana, the Sanya, Ad Masai Mis Oinin Alav Kol Hayoim. So how long is the status of being an Oinin? It's all day. Okay, let's slow down for 1 second. We're gonna go to Umay Tanahi in a second. Let's look at question 1. Matirutzu begamar al stiris to Reb Shimon im oinin mesi Pesach ve'ezet teretz min hashloish itself bekasha. Okay, so Rav Mari said kan shemes ol meis v'kaver b'yadalid tehavi deraisa v'kan shemes b'yadgimel v'kaver b'yadalid, and we ended up asking a kasha over there. Abaya said kan shemes koinim chatzais, and one is shemes achar chatzais. And therefore, you already had the chiyuv of bringing the carbon first before you became an oinen. And Rava said, "Kan koidim sheshacht b'zarkol of nidche mepesach ach sheshachta v'zarka lav yechilos pesach ma'akev. So it depends on, was it before the shechita and the zrika, and therefore we since you were an oinin before, even though you was already after chatzos, but since you didn't do the shechita and the zrika, so therefore the din is that you don't bring the carbon pesach, or you already did the shechita and the zrika, and the chiddush is that regarding the chilos pesach. Okay, fine. So now let's see this next piece. So my tana desanya ad masim is oinin alav kol hayoy. So what is the status of being an oinin all day, which is mashma only that first day, not at night. Rabbi Yomer Kozman Shol Nikvar. As long as there's not been a burial that took place, the din is that you're still an oinin. Says Rashi, Kosak Hadatach Lakula Polig. It sounds like maybe he's actually going lenient. Yomer the Kol Hayoim Lamitzri Demishikavu Hoter Miyad. It actually sounds like a kula. So he said the person died, and then you did the kavura for the first shita, you still are an oinin, even until that night, no matter what. According to Rabbi, it's mashma, you only have the status of aninus until the kavura. But let's say you did the kavura and it's 3 p.m, so now you're not an oinin anymore. So I'm asking, let's say the kavura never took place on the same day of the misa, so 1 second. Everyone would have to hold that if the misa and the kavura took place on the same day, that this person is still the status of tumah deraisa, and then that night also is a tumah derabanan. Vasu Rabbi Omer Kozman Shol Nikvar Hakaver Ishtri loss. You're going to tell me on that day, as long as the kavura just took place, now you're not an oinim. Mi'ika deleisle v'achvisa kiyomar. The pasuk says v'achvisa kiyomar. It doesn't mean until the kavura. It means the whole day. That's the pashtus of the pasuk. Amav sheishis ayom kavura koi, which basically means like this: if it's the Yom Misa and the Yom Kavura on the same day, there's nothing to talk about. Of course, that night is a din d'Rabbanan. We're talking about the Misa was done. There was someone died on one day, and then it was only the next day in which the Kavura took place. And there is the machlokus: are you an oinein the rest of the day, or only until the Kavura? But certainly not at night. So Maskeh Rabbi Yosef Ella Haditani Hashmeal me. So when you hear about the person who died, let's say a person died 2 weeks ago, you just heard about it. It says Kamalakat at Samais. It has the same status as the person who hears that, or someone else reburies. You're dead. That we're lean, you can eat kachim only that night. Machlal Yom Kavura, on that day itself. Afil erev nami lo'achol, you would not be able to eat, right? Because it's only talking about Yom Shemua and Likadat Samos, that night you could eat kachim. But we just saw before, but when it comes to Yom Kavura, that night you would not be able to. Hamani, so who's that like? Because you're telling me that the Yom Kavura, it's either as soon as the Kavura is over, or that next night is okay. But this is mashma, that's only by Yom Shemua and Likadat Samais that you could eat kachim that night, not Yom Kavura. Elotoritz, you can answer like this: Ad masem isayin in a love koloi sayim vileiloi. Actually, the aninus is day and night. Rabbi Omer Kozman Shol Nikvar. Oh, as long as the burial didn't take place. Avol Nikvar bluleiloi. If there was kavura, then the night doesn't count. So therefore, it's not telling you that that day stops, but the night doesn't count. Amru Kamei the Rabbi Yomi Yomer Gavar Rabbi Rabbi Yosef Lema Hachi. A great person like Rabbi Yosef said a statement. Lema the Rabbi Lakula. It sounds like therefore Rabbi is being lenient that as soon as the kavura takes place, either as we said before in the Havamina that you're not only aware, but at least not the next night. Lasanya on Masim Yisayin and love Kolzman Shenu Nikvar. Afil mekanvi adasari yomim dir Rabbi. Now this seems to be pumfakert, that it's not that day, but if for whatever reason the kavur didn't take place for 10 days, for whatever reason, you are considered an oinin. So actually, Rabbi sounds a little chumrah. Only that day, not that night. Rabbi Omer Kolzman Shlo Nikvar. The Nikvar, if he's buried, typhus leiloi, then that night is typhus. Typhus love, and that night is typhus. Amru Kamei the Rava, Medikaimer Rabbi Yom Kippur typhus lam the Rabbanon, that since you did the Kippur today, that night is considered to be a Tumah the Rabbanon, an Einin the Rabbanon, Machlad the Yom Misa, typhus lam the Raisa. It must be that Yom Misa, that night is the Raisa. It's only Yom Kvura. Again, the Yom Misa was on one day, Yom Kvura is on the next day. That night is Min Rabbanon, which is mashma that Yom Misa, that night is actually the Raisa. V'savar Rabbi Anina Saleh the Raisa, is that true? V'sanya Hein Hayoim. These karbanos are today. Ani Hayoim Aser. Today I'm Aser. The Laila Mutter. But at night it's Mutter. Says Rashi, Hein Mashma the Elu HaKarbanos Chalukim Mishar Karbanos. Shalein Shamos La'achan Bi'ani the Slayim Mimnei Shukum Einin V'in Koyin Oichan. So you need to be makel at night by Aharon. Of L'dairais Sheish Kohanim Achon Ben B'Yayin Ben Malayil Aser. So the problem is that there weren't supply and demand over there. Aharon had to be the one who ate the carbon, so therefore we were makel at night, dafka for him at night, right? Hein hayom ani hayom aser v'laylo mutter, which is for Aharon HaKohen was allowed to eat that night. However, for all future generations, even that night is aser. Dear Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Omer and Ninos Laila in the Torah el Medivri Sefer. So, Oilam the Rabbanon. So really, it's the night is the Rabbanon, and it's the Rabbanon he. Says the Gemara continuing, V'chachamim also chizik l'divrehim yosim mishal Torah. What does that mean? So as we know, a lot of times that even though it's only din the Rabbanon, we're more strict when it comes to din the Rabbanon for also chizik l'divrehim. Says Rashi, Mamashi also the Torah l'divreha, that sometimes we're more strict when it comes to din the Rabbanon. It says Taisus in Perushu yosim mishal Torah, the Alma el Kalemer. It doesn't mean that we're more strict, but it means also chizak devarehim yosim mamash yosas atayol l'devareha. Okay, ayin taisus. Okay, we're going to stop there. Let's maybe see another question or two. Question 2. Tanya, ad ma'asai mis einin love kol hayoim. So how long is aninas? All day. Rabbi says kol zman shlo nikvar. So b'may kamifagi Rebbe Chachamim. What's this machlokas? And how do we explain this brisa? So we're talking about Yom Kivura. We're not talking about Yom Misa, because Yom Misa, certainly that day is Aser as well as the next night. We're talking about the Misa was the day before. He died the day before, and now today is the Yom Kivura. And the whole machlokus is, what's the status of that night? The Chachamim say that he's an oinin all day, which excludes the night. Rabbi says, Kol Zaman Shlo Nikvar, Kolimer, Afil Achar Yud Yomim, Typhus Leilo. Where typhus that night, actually he's more strict, and says that when it comes to Yom Kivura, it means that it's possible if you didn't do the Kivura for 10 days, you're an oinen for those 10 days, and that night. So really the machlokus is that night, whether or not the din is that we're strict. So again, it's possible that even though the night maybe we're more lenient, but sometimes the Chachamim will make a chizuk l'dvarehim to also restrict the nighttime as well. Question TA 21. Nope, nothing there. So TB 23 asked the question that we saw before on question 1. Meis v'kaver b'yadalad or meis b'yadgimel kaver b'yadalad im oinim koidem or achar chatzos. Im koidem or achar hazrikas hakarbon. I think it's beautifully written. Nei aninos nisrafa divrei Yirmiyah el gimel kushas ikshu adkan.